Your family relationships are in your mind. When you close your eyes, your family disappears. Where do they go? Nowhere, but doing this exercise helps you to recognize that your relatives exist as thoughts in your mind. If the focus of your inner dialogue about your family members is on what they're doing that's wrong, then that's precisely how your relationship with them will be experienced. If your inner speech centers on what's annoying about them, then that's what you'll notice. As much as you're inclined to blame them for your annoyance, it's yours, and it's coming from your thoughts. If you make a decision to put your inner attention, your life energy, on something quite different, your relationship will change. In your thoughts, where your family relationships exist, you'll no longer be annoyed, angry, hurt, or depressed. If in your mind you're thinking, my intention is to be authentic and peaceful with this relative, then that's what you'll experience, even if that relative continues to be exactly the way he or she has always been. Changing your mind is really changing your relationships. Being authentic and peaceful with your relatives is only a thought away. You can learn to change your thoughts by intending to create authentic and peaceful feelings within yourself. No one is capable of making you upset without your consent, and you've given your consent too frequently in the past. When you begin practicing the intention to be authentic and peaceful, you withdraw your consent to be in the lower energy. You connect to peace itself and decide to bring peace to your relatives, thereby immediately gaining the power to change the energy of family gatherings. Prior to my waking up to the power of intention, family visits were events that caused me consternation because of the attitudes and behavior of some of my wife's relatives. I'd prepare for a Sunday afternoon family visit by getting anxious and upset over what I anticipated to be a fretful, lousy experience, and I seldom disappointed myself. I'd focus my thoughts on what I didn't like, and I defined my relationship with my in-laws in this manner. Gradually, as I began to understand the power of intention and left my ego behind, I substituted kindness, receptivity, love, and even beauty for my former annoyed and angry assessments. Before family get-togethers, I'd remind myself that I'm what I choose to be in any and all circumstances, and I chose to be authentically peaceful and have a good time. In response to something that used to annoy me, I'd now say to my mother-in-law in a loving way, "I never thought of it that way. Tell me more." In response to what I previously considered to be an ignorant comment, I'd respond, "That's an interesting point of view. When did you first learn about this?" In other words, I was bringing my own intention to be in a state of peace to this encounter and was refusing to judge them. The most amazing things began to happen. I started looking forward to having these family members at our home. I began to see them as much more enlightened than I'd previously thought. I actually enjoyed our times together, and every time something came up that I'd found annoying in the past, I'd overlook it and respond with love and kindness instead. At an earlier stage of my life, expressions of racial or religious prejudice were a stimulus for my anger and resentment. Now I'd quietly respond with a kind and gentle reminder of my own opinions and simply let the matter drop. Over the years, I found that not only did the racial and religious slurs diminish to zero, but I noticed that my in-laws were expressing tolerance and even love toward minorities, as well as those who practiced religions different from their own. Although my primary intention was to stay in a state of peace, I discovered that by not joining in the low energies of my in-laws, not only was the entire family more peaceful, but many enjoyable and even enlightening conversations developed. I had as much to learn from my in-laws as I had to teach. Even when I disagreed vehemently with a judgment directed at me, if I remembered my intention to have a peaceful relationship with them, I was able to do just that. No longer did I think about what I disliked, or what was missing, or what always had been. I stayed focused on making these gatherings fun, loving, and most important to me, peaceful. And what you have to learn to do is develop an inner candle flame that never flickers, though the worst goes before you. You must know that all of the problems, all the difficulties, all the victimization that you may feel in your life, all of the strings that are being pulled by somebody else, are really things that you have allowed up until now. And now you make a recommitment to your own excellence, or your own non-victim status, if you will. Some of the categories of where people dichotomize and judge are good and bad. They try to put the whole world into what is good and what is bad based upon some perception I have. And those things that don't fit into it,
the way I think they ought to be are bad, and all the things that I agree with are good. And so you find yourself going through your whole life running into half of the people or more who are doing things in a different way than you do and judging them all to be bad, and therefore being their victim because they now own your emotional strings. Remember, being a victim isn't necessarily a physical thing. In fact, that's very seldom the thing, because we have laws to protect each other from being physically abused by each other. It isn't as if somebody's putting you into a jail, into a cell. It is the victimization is what you experience in your mind and in your emotions. And this comes from judging, from categorizing, from compartmentalizing people and putting them into the compartments. And then when they don't fit with the behavior that you think they should exhibit, you find yourself upset and worked up and angry and hurt. It's really important to develop a quiet mind when it comes to all of this. A quiet mind is a mind that is at peace, a mind that doesn't judge. Just because you label somebody else to be something obnoxious or nasty or hurtful doesn't mean that that's what they are. That's just your judgment, and that's your definition of yourself as someone who needs to judge. So learning not to judge and unclogging your mind, if you will, of judgments and negativity, and quieting your mind.
I read an interesting article this summer on the astronauts and their spiritual experiences of having gone into the universe outside of the Earth plane and looking back. And one of the astronauts was quoted as saying that when he looked back at the Earth, this blue planet, like what our sky is what you see from out there, and you look then in one direction, you see Earth and this tiny little dot, this blue dot, and then you look out the other way and you see an infinite number of worlds, and you look all around you and you're surrounded by this infinity of this universe. He said, I realized that there's an intelligence to this system, that it is an intelligent system that is all absolutely, and he's like, it happened for him in a moment, this instantaneous kind of realization that there's an intelligence to all of this, that the intelligence that is a part of the universe, or that allows the universe to work. Again, the label isn't important. He said it made him realize that it's all working absolutely perfectly, and that it's all on purpose, and that all of it has a purpose. Well, I have discovered that most people really don't believe they have a purpose, or they spend a big hunk of their life trying to discover their purpose, or they will find so many events transpiring in their life that seem to be inconsistent with any kind of grander purpose that it's impossible for them to accept that this is anything but just one grand accident. I know it's not an accident. And once you discover your purpose, and the way that you discover that, that's that secret source. So that's the secret force, if you will, that is within you at all times. This invisible, silent, empty space that is a part of every one of us. That is what allows us to be. My own development is probably just as appropriate to talk about here as anything on these tapes, because I often think to myself that if I can do it, coming from where I came from, that anybody can. I come from impoverished beginnings, a child who never had an allowance in his life, didn't even know what it was. When other kids would talk about my allowance, I didn't know anything about that, because there just wasn't anybody there to give me an allowance. The people that were there didn't have it to give away anyway. So it was very, very early in my own development that I learned the secrets of being my own person and my own strengths. That internal kind of knowingness isn't something I believe that I learned somewhere along the line through some magical, instantaneous kind of revelation. It was something that I believe I showed up with here, and that I think that every single person has that capacity for, but they don't seem to choose it. And it's like knowing that you have that inner strength, and knowing that nobody else can make you unhappy, and knowing that no circumstance out there is too big for you to handle, and knowing that when you go off to sleep at night, no matter what has happened all day long, that you still only have yourself to live with, and that very private inner world wherein you talk to yourself, and we call this self-talk or whatever you want to call it,
All of us do this all the time. We have these conversations with ourselves, which is really two people. We are having a conversation with ourselves. And we do this all the time. And what the quality of those conversations are, how you process the daily events of your life and all of the things that are happening to you, is really the secret source of enormous strength. And then, as you get a little older, you begin to put a label on that. You begin to identify that in some way as something that is more than just an intuitive way of processing the world in a positive direction. It's more than that. You begin to realize that you're not alone. And a lot of people believe that they are alone in the world, and that this inner world of thought, this inner world of power and of inner conviction, or whatever you want to call it, is something that you can rely on, but it's not just something that you're alone with. And as I got older and more experienced in it, I began to see that I believe I have someone with me, or guides with me, or some kind of help available to me at all times. And it's just really a question of whether you decide to believe it or don't believe it. It isn't anything we can put to a double-blind study and have scientists come up and say, no, this doesn't exist or that doesn't exist. It's just a knowing. And when you have that guide, and almost all of the great spiritual masters and the great religions and so on, when you begin to study them, as I have done in more recent years in my life and written books about them and produced tapes about them, you begin to discover that the greatest thinkers, the great contributors, all have this sort of inner knowing that they're not alone, that help is available to you. Help in the form of whatever you want to call it isn't even relevant. If you want to call it God, or you want to call it Buddha, or you want to call it Christ, or you want to call it spirituality or consciousness or whatever, it isn't the label that's important. It's the experience of it. And it's the knowing that it's there, and knowing that you can go there at any time.
You have to really get your past clear. You have to get out of it. You have to get out of the wake. You know, the wake is the trail that is left behind, right? The wake doesn't drive the boat. It's just a trail that's left behind. It's an illusion to believe that the things that happened to you in your past are the reason why your life isn't working today. You can go to therapy for the rest of your life and analyze it and figure it all out, but it still all happened. And in a universe in which there's an intelligent system guiding every single aspect of it, every mosquito, every snail, all of the passageways inside of your body, and all of the glorious ways that the planets all align with each other. There's one force in the universe that's flowing through everything, that there's no mistakes in it. And I think for me, two things really happened that I really strongly urge you, before you go any further, before we go any further here, is to really examine the wake of your life and to understand that it's just a trail that is left behind, and to let it go and merge yourself into the present moment, which is where God is. God isn't going to be doing anything different an hour from now than God is doing now. And God isn't doing anything different right now than God was doing an hour ago. So that God is all there is now. Just now. And any time you are not here now, you are away from God. And any time you are away from being at peace, you have sent God out of your life. So connecting on a spiritual level, on an energy level, which I'll go into great depth later, is really removing yourself from your past. I've written about this in a book a few years ago called You'll See It When You Believe It. But for me, the real turning point in my life came when I was able to finally, once and for all, practice this thing called forgiveness. There's a Chinese proverb that says if you're going to pursue revenge, you'd better dig 2 graves. And of course, Mark Twain's famous line about forgiveness. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. On the heel that has crushed it. And I tell you this, and I say this to you because, not to elicit any sympathy, because in my way of looking at the world, and all of the writing that I have been doing this past quarter of a century, and particularly in the last year with the spiritual solution to every problem, I have come to a very serious awareness that everything in the wake had to happen, and the evidence for it is that it did. That's the evidence. That's all the evidence you really need. And if you'll just stop for a moment, and this is a little weird, and I'll point it out, but in a universe which is endless, in which there is no such thing as time, in which there are no beginnings and no ends, and in which we are all infinite souls, there is an infinite number of times that we can be here, incarnated in any number of ways, endlessly. I mean, when you think of no beginnings and no ends, that used to be one of the hardest things for me to do when I was a child. And it still is when I really contemplate it. The idea of being dead for 1,000,000 years is not a problem. Is it for you? 1,000,000 years? You say, all right, I can wait it out. I'll just be dead anyway. But forever? Like another 1,000,000 and another 1,000,000 and then 4 billion more, and you haven't even gotten started yet on how long you're going to be dead. The endlessness of it all, the infinity of it all, the no beginnings and no ends, the no boundaries of it all, is almost too startling to comprehend when we are coming from our egos, which have beginnings and ends. So that who's to say, do you know who the most influential person in my life was? The person who has allowed me to come here and to speak about these things on these tapes and on this program? The person who has allowed me to write and express and experience the kinds of things that I've experienced and to grow in a spiritual dimension. You know who the most influential person in my life was? My father. This man who walked out when I was born. This man who had absolutely nothing to do with me, and the only reason I went to his grave was to find out if my name was on the death certificate. That's all I wanted to know. Did he even acknowledge in death that he had a son named Wayne? And he did. But who's to know that God and Melvin Lyle Dyer, before he incarnated in 1915, had a conversation. And God said to him, what do you want to do in this trip around? And he said, I'd like to teach one person forgiveness. So I'll go there and I'll just be an asshole. And that's what I'm signing up for. And there'll come a time when my youngest son will have to forgive me. And in the process of doing that, he will teach millions of others. Who knows? Who's to say?